everyone. Welcome to another episode of Spotlight on CS Ops. I'm here with my trusty co-partner in crime, Matthew Lin, all the way from Austin, Texas.
Both trustee and criminal, as you said.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Don.
And today we have the pleasure of speaking with JP von Halle. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Von Hall.
Von Hall, sorry. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today, JP.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thank you.
So JP, you're someone who's been, in the space for quite some time. You're currently a consultant. You've worked with companies like Carbon Black, Splunk, just to name a couple big names. Nothing, those are no small companies or no unknown companies. Can you tell us a little bit about like your journey and just, how you got to where you are today and in the consulting field in CS?
Sure. And thanks first for having me. I'm glad to be here. So I'm Boston-based, have a consulting practice in customer success, like you said, bringing best practices from large, medium, and small leading organizations in a very workable, simple way. I've 20 plus years experience in technology space, started as an engineer, Bachelor of Science, Computer Science, so did development first, and then moved through different parts of customer success, support, professional services, and the CSM realm. Most notable organizations are from last to most recent DocuSign, where I was leading the PM team during their high growth phase. So anything that was a significant project for DocuSign at that phase was going through my team. Then moved into VMware Carbon Black. So first Carbon Black, which was eventually bought by VMware, where I led the strategic customer success management team. We were accountable for about $100 million of ARR from the largest companies that the company had. And then most recently, before starting up my own consulting practice, I was with Splunk, where I led their customer success operations organization. We were accountable for 185 CSMs being successful with their $4 billion of ARR. So everything from best practices, gain site, methodologies, templates, etc. So anything to make sure that we were consistent in executing across the different geos and consistent in acting with the customers in the best way. So that was the path. And what brought me to CS Ops too, just to round that out, is in a lot of that career I was in delivery, sometimes quasi-delivery operations. But I found even when I was in delivery roles, I always gravitated towards solving problems systemically. So you see that again and again, where maybe onboarding, you see doesn't work well with customer A, and it happens with customer B. I was never okay to solve it just for customer A or customer B. It was, how do we once and for all solve this? And so even in delivery, I always had a hand in the operational side. It's just the way my mind and most people's minds that are in ops works. And then eventually just decided I wanted to be in that full time, which I've really enjoyed.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love the trajectory, like getting more and more into like systematic things. As an aside, like, I worked at Splunk, Matthew worked at Splunk, you were at Splunk. We somehow all missed each other. I was probably the first one, and then I think it was Matthew, and then you were there. But, dealing with prescriptive paths and the whole value journey that they were building, very, very familiar with all those. But like, as you look at your career and like, as you look at like the things that you're saying, like you're talking about like building structure, lots of systematic ways of delivering customer success. Like, is there any secret sauce that you kind of learned along the way that, that you believe or that you feel has helped companies drive more retention or more adoption or better experiences, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, there's parts to the secret sauce that I could explain probably in a minute, but essentially it's really thinking of in terms of the customer journey. So what are those key steps that a customer needs to go through to be successful, and not thinking of it as just an endpoint, but this ongoing dynamic set of things that are occurring. Some major elements for me include the onboarding phase, where you really want to make sure that there's a seamless transition of information. And that's a theme of mine throughout, is how do you transfer data and information about a customer seamlessly throughout their life cycle? rather than, in onboarding, for example, starting all over again with the same questions they've answered sales. You really don't want that. In that onboarding phase, make sure there's clarity about roles and responsibilities. You're enabling the customer, you're identifying those key players. Another one of those key activities that I think about a lot is sometimes referred to as a cadence meeting. I refer to it as customer success review. So that's the recurring meeting that you're working with your kind of tactical hands on feet on the ground customer representatives to make sure that you're progressing in a tactical way towards those objectives that have been established. Because otherwise you go EBR to EBR, nothing happens in between. So how do you keep progressing in between? And a real structured way of having that cadence meeting, that you have the right players, you're checking what they're using in terms of license utilization, in terms of functionality, achieving objectives, how is their training going, and so on. EBRs is another important one. Then that's something that you could do from quarterly to yearly, depending on the size of the customer, where you're looking back for some period of time as to how everything worked in terms of the objectives achieved or not achieved, what is being adjusted for the next period of time, and what the upcoming objectives are. Health check is another one that can be important in there. So ProServe sometimes goes into an organization, make sure that everything's set up well initially, but then that organization goes off and maybe develops in that same space for a while without any assistance. How do you do that health check from time to time to ensure that things are going well? And then a whole methodology around expansion and renewal. Renewal is very much about realized value. And that's been set up throughout the course of your activities with the customer. If you do it properly, you're capturing that value so you can describe it during the renewal process. And expansion is very much about identifying additional needs, which I describe as either quantitative or qualitative needs. Quantitative, I need more of the same thing. Qualitative is I need something notably different than I had above and beyond what I had before. So that's the high level.
JP, there was something that stuck out to me as you were describing it. I think you said you were 485 CSMs under your wing at Splunk. It was hundreds.
That was 185 and
485. Okay, I gave you some bonus ones there. The question I want to pose still sticks, which is from that and through the journey that you've had at other companies. There's a tension between CS ops saying we've developed processes, they look great on paper, they work, let's use information exchange as the example. And then some members who are customer success managers or others on the team are like, no, you're crimping my style. I've got a way I want to do this. This customer is a snowflake, and we've sort of heard all of that. So what did you do with that tension of we've developed a process we think works versus the field saying, yeah, but then I'm just a robot. I don't care to do it that way. What's your response there?
I think it's a great question, as different aspects to it. So let's first talk about the way in which I believe you should roll out new programs. And I think it's an essential question. The biggest mistake that ops and, in fact, executive management often make is that they decide things in a bubble. Never having done the role, often they decide what's going to be best for whatever the given group is. In this case, it's the CSMs, but it could be for anybody else that's an individual contributor that's doing the thing day in, day out. So they make the mistake of doing that in a bubble, and then they're surprised when there's pushback to that. So what I feel very strongly about is that you need to involve your constituent base, the CSMs themselves, the CSM managers, to one, identify priorities. So it's not even, we've established what the priorities are, now let's work on this. It's actually stepping back even beyond that and saying, let's jointly agree on what the pain points are today, what the priorities are that we want to take on. So you get buy-in from early on. You then work with them to understand how they've overcome some of those pain points themselves. So often there's some corner of the organization that has overcome that pain point partially or fully. Sometimes it's not fully operationalized. but you pull from those best ofs that have been somewhat proven out. And people, again, they're buying in by the fact that you allowed them to help prioritization. They then were involved in the solutioning. They're then involved in the rollout. So you get rid of a fair amount of what you just asked, Matthew, which is a really hard question. There are some that still will not want a system, and there becomes a little bit of negotiation. For me, when I roll out processes and programs, I describe it as it's not really ever thou shalt 100% of the time do it exactly this way or else. It's more of here's best practices that we've learned from everyone. And if you choose not to do a step, it's not because you didn't realize it existed or you know how to do it. You consciously decided it wasn't appropriate in the given situation.
Okay.
Last point there, though, is it's always easier to roll out programs with new people than existing people. So your existing folks will often push back, even with trying to get them involved as you can.
Yeah, I definitely hear you there, especially like if someone's been there for 20 years and they've been through the gamut of change and they're just like, oh, new guy with a new program, here we go. So totally get that. I love your idea too. Like I think, building out champion networks of people that can help like drive the ideals or drive like the solution and then help out with maybe championing the ideal to, the rest of the crew and just being a spokesperson and not just having it as like this one CS ops group that's telling the world or the field, thou shalt. So I really like those ideas. How did you also like you touched on like building out a value chain or um, value realization sort of process or workflow. What does that mean to you? Like what does value realization look like in your world?
Well, I mean, in the end, value is in the eye of the customer, right? So they get to decide what the value is and whether it's been achieved. And you always have to remember that. So what you're trying to do is ascertain early on in the pre-sales process, what does value look like to them? What are their goals? And then continually revisiting those to ensure that they're achieving them. Now, sometimes there can be a revamping of the goals and knowledge. I'll use a parallel, which is I go to my auto mechanic and because my car broke down, and I just described it as broke down, and then he does some analysis and says it's the alternator, and he explains to me what an alternator is. Now we can potentially have a more sophisticated conversation if I take on the terminology of somebody that's an expert then. So you always want to go back to the customer's terminology, but as you jointly become more sophisticated, you bring them along, you can potentially have a much more sophisticated conversation about what that value and that goal looks like in its component parts.
Very cool. And is it when you think about value, like how does that translate into like what the what the CSM does, like in the customer success plan or whatever people are calling it nowadays, account plan, account value plan. I've heard so many different terms, but do you translate those outcomes into the activities that the CSM should be doing?
Yeah, it's the most important thing. So again, you have to be eagle-eyed on those goals that the customer has and continually drive and validate because those goals can change over time. So an example too of the adjustment of goals can be maybe vendor management had a set of goals when they purchased your software, but now a whole other team, that's the project delivery team, is involved. You have to verify that those goals are correct. You have to continually verify that they are still correct, maybe with a new administration leadership, right? But you have to stay on those goals.
Yeah, that makes sense.
How have you, JP, how do you do that? Like, do you just point blank ask in the hopefully the QBR, the EBR? Do you occasionally embrace some of the digital technology to do some of that work?
Yeah.
What's the key to validating those goals are still out there.
Yeah.
Still understood.
And it's a matter of doing it in those places you said, but then also the data continuity aspect I talked about before. So let's use objectives as an example. Objectives is a perfect example when I talk about data continuity. In the pre-sales process, objectives were identified for the sale. That's a key part of the sales process, any decent sales process. So you want to make sure as much as possible that flows seamlessly into the handoff process between sales, PS, and customer success. And it shouldn't be just in somebody's scribbled OneNote or email. It should be in a system somewhere like a customer success platform or a CRM. So it lives somewhere. As you have those different meetings that I'm discussing, like cadence meetings, you're continually revisiting and updating the key data points for the customer so that they're immediately visible to all. It's not just a series of conversations. Anybody at any point from the executive ranks on down can look up at that customer and see their current objectives and how they're achieving their objectives. But it's not even just objectives that you're tracking. You're tracking the key players. You want to identify who the key roles are in an organization and ensuring that you have those roles. If you don't, making sure you go after them along with the salesperson finding those roles. So, for example, maybe you don't have a champion or you don't have an executive at the customer. You make sure you track those down and they go into the system. It can be other things like key data points of theirs around the utilization of licenses. It can be their feature requests, their support requests. So that's where the importance of a analytics system is important, but also entering data in the system on a continual basis so that data flows.
I like that. I always use the analogy of like, ordering a tomato soup at a restaurant. Like, imagine the waiter, waitress is the salesperson. They have that data has to transfer back to the kitchen.
Yeah.
The kitchen shouldn't be, one day deciding they're going to open up a can of soup and serve that, or in the next day they, get some fresh tomatoes and make the soup, fresh. Like they should have some type of recipe that aligns to whatever that menu item that the customer purchased, and having that data flow so that there's continuity and quality of service. Like every time someone orders a tomato soup, we always get it the same way, and it's according to a recipe. I find obviously in a kitchen, maybe it's easier, although maybe Gordon Ramsay would think it's a lot harder, and not all the kitchens do that. But in a tech company, that's like significantly harder, because it's not just a bowl of soup. It's a lot more complex, especially when we're delivering these large systems that have this really complicated value frameworks, or the complicated like set of benefits that you can potentially have. So I appreciate that, like, what you're saying is like, yeah, you drive structure, but like, it's not just 5 or 6 menu items. There's a laundry list of things that have to be kind of structured and made sure that there's continuity of the data model and all the services.
What's an interesting nuance of your analogy is then when they say to you, unless we get this new clam chowder soup, which you don't have in now, unless you get that in, we're never coming back again. You work with the customer
or the missing feature, right? Like, hey, I was supposed to get corn in my clam chowder, or when are you going to roll out corn?
And we're leaving you, and we're your biggest customer, and we're leaving you unless you have clam chowder.
Love it. So often we say, like, I'm curious what your take on this is, but like, technology is often being commoditized. There's so many, competitors doing the same thing. Is this kind of the secret sauce, so to speak, around, even though we're in a commoditized world, and then maybe it's a feature to feature war, driving value and the realization of that value can often distinguish competitors significantly, because even though you might be buying features, but if you can't articulate that value, it's hard to say, hey, I'm going to renew for 10 million if you can't show that there's 10x the value somehow.
So you bring up a great question. It's actually something that I learned over time working for two leaders in the industry, so all of us Splunk, but also at Carbon Black. So at Carbon Black, it was a very advanced security software, and there were all sorts of high-end competitors that we had, but we also had mid and low-end customers, or competitors rather, sorry. And sometimes a customer would leave us saying, we know the company we're going to is not as good in delivery as you are. It doesn't have a sophisticated software, but it's sophisticated enough, and it costs half or a third or a quarter or that much less. And as we're doing cost cutting, we just need to do that, right?
Yeah. We still get the soup. Like it's
right.
It's tasty as your soup.
And the nuance there is you also want to think about when you're in a leadership role like that, what are your competitive advantages, and trying to move the customer down the road towards using those functions that are competitive advantages. Because as you're living in the commoditized world, and they're using all functionality they could find elsewhere for the most part, they can leave anytime.
Mm-hmm. And certainly, yeah, something that we're always, I think, that's the struggle in CS or post sales, is that hitting that retention number. That's the goalpost, right? So any framework that we can deliver always can be quite helpful.
But again, with your differentiators, that's hugely important. It's not just a matter of are they using core functionality of yours, but are they using that functionality that is a differentiator? And one of the things I take them through is what I call a capability map. And capability map has basically, it's a table that shows capabilities in a particular functional area. So maybe for security, it might be the MITRE framework. You probably both know something about that. And it kind of says, here are the main functions in the MITRE framework and what we do and which of our technologies you're planning to roll out in that framework. And so what you're trying to do is have them always have an eye towards what is the full suite of functionality that they should be considering for you. And you'll do that on regular EBRs, sometimes the cadence meetings, but continually re-educate them as to, okay, I realize you're focusing on capability A and B, but best practices say C, D, and E should be there too at some point. And that does a couple of things. One is educates them as to your technology and offerings, but sometimes will cause them to open up the kimono and explain to you that they actually have C, D, and E covered by a competitor.
Right.
So you have a much better idea of that environment that you're in.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and I long for the day when I and others in customer facing roles are better questioners, or somehow are able to elicit information like that in a more ready way. I think it's the same for upsell, growth opportunities, whatever you want to call it. It's like, yeah, the person who asks the well-formed question or interviews well often wins the game here in this field because they're uncovering that type of information, JP.
Yeah. But here's what's interesting, going back to my comment before about doing things in a consistent and structured manner, is if you structure your processes well and your data in the system well, it'll lead the CSM down the path of capturing that information. I'll give you an example. So at VMware, we had on-prem and cloud offerings, and our goal, like a lot of vendors, was to get customers to the cloud. And at one point, one of our CSMs did a really good job about uncovering a situation where they could move to the cloud. And it turned out all he asked about from the customer was, what's your life cycle for changing out your hardware, which is very common in security systems, right? And so we moved that as a data point into our systems of what we were tracking. And now every CSM knew that that's something that they should capture.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we just didn't depend on the art of one person or another person. We tried to through something that was real-time learning, I'll call it. They knew what they had to do.
Yeah. What are some of the, I mean, that's a great example, but what are some of the other projects that you've worked on or flows you've put in, big or small? Maybe it was a pinpoint thing, maybe it was a complete overhaul that you were just like, yeah, this is why I do this kind of work.
Yeah. So Splunk, there were a couple of really good examples. I was actually brought in to create what they called the gold standard. And it's probably particularly striking to both of you that have been in there at various points, but probably well past when you guys had left, there was no more centralized group to ensure that everybody was doing things in a consistent way. So because of that, all the geos started to just do their own thing. And so I was brought in to try and create the standard for how we would do things. And I did it exactly the way I described before, which is I brought all those different geos together with representatives and said, okay, what are your priorities? What's working well? What's working badly for you? Let's take best of from APAC and apply it all around the world. Let's take from the government sector, et cetera. And so creating that gold standard was really a lot of fun and a lot of challenge too. It had a lot of the challenges you guys described. Some people didn't work along with it. Some people felt like they were a snowflake or their organization was a snowflake, which I largely I don't believe generally. There are nuances, but it's not night and day.
Even snowflakes they're all cold and they're all white.
I got to remember that, man. And so I really enjoyed that process. It was hard, very hard. And I think one of the questions you ask sometimes is what'd you learn? What could you have done better? And this was one of my more significant forays into operations. I'd done some operations previously, but a lot of times it's more lightweight. So this is a really big with 185, four different geos, if you will, including federal, and $4 billion business. It was significant. And the thing I would have done differently in hindsight is I started a little bit too theoretical because they asked me to create the gold standard. And so I started to really create a top-down gold standard. I wish in hindsight that I tried to look for more tangible things to roll out earlier on.
Okay.
Which is what I adjusted to, but I didn't adjust as quickly as I would have liked.
I love that advice.
Yeah, and I guess is that because it's somewhat what you're talking about? Like we've been sort of bouncing between strategic, strategy, and then more kind of the operationalization of that strategy, and getting into the systems and how do you stick it in tools like Gainsight, Tango, whatever you're using, Salesforce or whatever it may be. Is that where you saw the breakdown? Like sometimes we might just get too in the heavens of strategy and not grounded enough.
Yeah.
Potentially possible operationally.
Yeah. Well, and there's a little bit of chicken and egg. So I don't believe in purely doing the tactical rollout of things piecemeal. I do believe in having some vision of how it goes together, but maybe it's not fully fleshed out before you roll a couple of things out.
Right.
For me, there's certain basic ones that are usually important, like that cadence meeting. Right. Any customer and any customer I deal with, whether they're small, medium, or large, now in my consulting practice, tomorrow can roll out a good cadence meeting where they're tracking in the key information and driving the key information on a customer, whether that's in a system or whether it's in a slide deck. And that's a big win right away.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, like low hanging fruit almost, right? Like having that cadence it's not too hard to implement, and hopefully the folks do it, but it's not too hard it's not a massive change.
Yeah, it's not a massive change. And back to my comment before about creating a structure, I have a baseline deck that I can provide to customers that allows them immediately to start with something that identifies those key elements that you want to have in a cadence meeting, or those key elements that you want to have for an EBR. And back to data continuity, how do you ensure that one flows into the other seamlessly? EBRs, for example, are notorious for taking massive amounts of time to create. It can take a month.
Yeah.
And if you want to do EDRs consistently, they can't take a month to put together. So how do you allow them to flow from that data in the system as much as possible? One of the things I was looking at Splunk that we didn't quite roll out when I was there was taking data from Snowflake, which are a system of record, and pushing it out to a PowerPoint deck, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I've encountered that a few times in my career, and it's so tough, right? Like it's so tough to get to that point, to have all
Yeah.
the data and be able to synthesize it so nicely that it fits so well in a PowerPoint.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even say all the data. I wouldn't ever have a goal probably that you're going to create 100% of the deck, but if you create 50 to 75% of the deck seamlessly, that's a good start.
Yeah, totally. I love the conversation. Yeah, you're really talking about strategy, the tactical stuff, the operations. You're sort of at that, I don't know, 500-600 level university course of CS opsing. Out of curiosity, like if you look back in your past, like before you started all this and before you started in CS, like anything that you wish you had known, like for some of our audience in here that watches this show are super young in their career or super young in their journey in CS ops or even customer success. Is there any kind of golden nuggets that maybe you'd point them to be more accomplished in their career, maybe faster?
Well, something that the three of us were talking about before the show started, I'll mention again, which is near and dear to my heart. You want to stay as close to the revenue as you can. So this is obviously a bad time in the market for customer success, whether it's CSMs or CSM operations. And it's because executive management sometimes doesn't understand the direct connection of the CSM organization to revenue. And so if they need to make cuts, they're always going to make cuts in areas that they don't perceive as revenue generating. So as a CSM or CSM organization, think about how you can be connected. An example for a CSM is you want one or more salespeople to publicly get up and say, I would not have renewed this deal. I would have not expanded this deal without Joe or Amy or Sue, my CSM. They were essential.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that's not sometimes brought up. But I mean, otherwise, it's a matter of listening to your customer, thinking about what those key points are about their objectives that you're helping drive. You want to be very empathetic, really genuinely care about them. There's an interesting aspect of the role too, that in the end, you work for the company you work for, but you do have to support your customer and sometimes get into hard discussions internally on behalf of your customer. And so I would do that any number of times. There's times a customer would ask me for a feature and I would push back, or I would really drill down. I think that was always my role, to drill down and say, okay, so why do you need this? You're focused on the solution, but why does it matter? And is it a P1 or a P2 or P3? So all of that you have to get. And sometimes I still push back on the customer. Some of that's tough love that you do as a CSM. And then other times I bring it back into the organization. And the organization, product management, for example, would say, no, it doesn't make any sense. And I would act like I was the customer. I would be a bit of a dog in there. I was like, no, I totally get why they need that and why this is causing them pain. And so, part of that is also then thinking you work for the vendor, but you work secondarily for your customer. You need to represent them, and sometimes need to have the hard conversations internally. And for those hard conversations, you also need to have a lot of credibility. You can't cry wolf every time something happens. So they have to know that you've battled 10 battles before you ever came to them for one of them.
Makes sense. Yeah.
100%. I love that sort of, I don't know if we would dare describe it as a dotted line to your customer, but maybe we should, or we should just toy with that. Your solid line to your own company and your reporting dotted line out to your customers, and see how that might work as a frame. We looked back. You told us some of the things you learned or wished that you had known. Give us a prediction for the future. Where do you see CS or CS ops headed?
I'm hoping it'll make a comeback in terms of its value. To do that again, we're going to have to be able to describe our direct revenue value better, and I'm hoping that's happening throughout. Obviously, the whole movement towards data analytics, AI, is where it's going to be at. Thinking, where I'm most intrigued are these systems that can look at all the data in the system. So, what comments the CSMs made, other internal people have made, the customers made. Is the customer behind on paying their bill? What did the emails seem like? What's the analysis of the customer's business altogether? So I think that's going to be a fascinating, in fact, I know it's going to be a fascinating new world in all industries, but definitely in CS. So you want to get your knowledge up in those areas. Some of it will be embedded in the CSPs and CRMs. You see that a lot already. But there can also be some additions that you can do yourself where you become more and more sophisticated using things like ChatGPT to analyze your customer situation before you ever talk to them.
Is as maybe a follow-up question, and hopefully this is not too controversial. Does the future have is the CSM in the future, or is it an account manager or an AE that's driving that value conversation? Or I'm curious how you would articulate
Well, yeah, that's the challenge that is today. A lot of the roles seem very related. Um, what I think of as an AE is a hunter, and so the hunter shouldn't be doing this role. I'm very clear about that. When you have an account manager, it becomes a little more nuanced of what's the difference between the account manager and the CSM. And I don't prefer actually having an account manager generally. I generally think of CSM as being everything post sales about realized value is what they're trying to accomplish, and the AE is being the hunter both in terms of the initial logo as well as the expansion.
yeah,
So there's always going to be that role that's advocating for the customer. There should always be, or you have problems.
yeah, I'm super aligned with that as well. Like, I think there's a role, but as you say, like, you got to figure out your position in revenue. You got to figure out your position in value. Otherwise, you're going to be benched and off the team.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, it was an absolute pleasure, like, just chatting with you, getting to know a little bit more about your world and what you believe in the CS ops and CS space. Like, you've got a ton of insights, and you seem to have been around the block quite a bit in terms of your experience. So quite a bunch of credibility that you're able to share with us today here. So thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you too. I would say the same for both of you. It was interesting as we prepped for this and we saw how many organizations we aligned on. It is indeed a small world.
Yeah,
I really appreciate the time with you today. It was a lot of fun.
awesome.
Very informative and a lot of fun. GP, thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks so much.